Hello and welcome to Casual Learning. I'm your host, John Bannan. Today I'm going to do a video on the world's greatest meatball. It's called Mom's Meatballs, and it's named after my mom, Camille Bannan, because she's the one I learned this from. All right, so what do you need for Mom's Meatballs? Well, you need ground beef, salt and pepper, onion, dried parsley, bread cubes, egg, milk, dash of oregano, and garlic powder. Mix it all up, form it into balls, and then fry them. So I have a skillet here, and I'm going to set that at about 350 degrees. I'm going to let that heat up while we work on the meatball mix. So what makes this meatball so different than any other meatball? And the answer really is there's a couple of secrets to it. The first secret, and the most important secret by far, is the use of fresh, store-bought bread instead of bread crumbs or instead of stale bread. So you use some actual sandwich bread, white sandwich bread. This is really the biggest difference in this meatball versus any other meatball, and it makes all the difference in the world. This sort of bread gives it a different flavor. It's softer. The bread itself absorbs some of the grease, so it makes it very flavorful. This is really the key. Another aspect of it, of course, is that you want to fry the meatballs and give it a nice dark brown, even black coating. And that's a lot of flavor there, too. Fried meatballs always taste much better than, let's say, meatballs put in an oven, cooked in an oven. Okay, so what's the first step? Well, first step is I want to cut up some onions. So I get my knife, and I always sharpen my knife in advance of any work because it's a lot easier to cut through something fibrous like an onion when you have a very sharp knife to do it with. About a dozen strokes there. Okay, so I got my onion. How I cut onions is I cut off one end, then I cut off the other end, and to avoid getting any onion juice in my eyes and crying, I just sort of peel off the first outer layer of the onion with my knife, and then I just take that outer layer off, and there's very little onion juice that gets in the air, so that doesn't cause any tearing, doesn't affect me at all cutting it, and I never have that problem when I cut an onion this way. So again, I cut one end, then I cut the other end, then I peel off that first layer. That just sort of naturally comes right off, and there you go. I don't want these dried onion skins to get into our onions. Nobody wants to eat that. Okay, so just cut the onions up just slice it up. Very simple. Just cut it like that. And then I just go across like this. Then I turn it, and then I do the same thing. You're not going to see any fancy knife work from me. I am not a trained chef. So that's how I dice up onions. And you don't necessarily want all the onion pieces to be perfectly the same size because each meatball is itself unique. And that's something about meatballs which makes them even better. You know, you have a bunch of meatballs, but there's always one meatball that looks better than the other ones, and that's the one you go for. So that's fine. It's okay to have less than uniform meatballs. Okay, so there's my onions. So I have a bowl, and I'm going to put my onions in there. All right. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut up my bread. So you get regular white sandwich bread. Could be fresh. Certainly, you don't have to. You don't have to use stale bread. You don't have to try and dry it out. You certainly don't use breadcrumbs. God forbid. That would ruin this recipe. So you get, you know, maybe 8, 10 slices of bread, and you cube it up. So I'm using a bread knife, and I'm making bread cubes, and these are all maybe half-inch cubes. And turn around, and I cut the bread just like I slice the onions. I cut everything this way. If you want me to dice something, this is the way I do it. And so we got our bread. Again, we'll do with this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I put 5 slices through that bread. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so now I think I have enough. It's sort of like making stuffing, but you're putting it in meatballs. So that's enough bread. So now I have my bowl with my onions in it. Now I'm going to take a package of, this is 4.5 pounds of ground beef. This is 80% lean, 20% fat. This is typical hamburger ground beef, and this is going to make a lot of meatballs. And these meatballs are so good, you're going to want to make a lot of them. So that's 4.5 pounds of ground beef. And I'll just throw that in there. Since you're going to be doing a lot of mixing with your hands in making the meatballs, it's okay to touch the ground beef. You don't have to use a spoon or anything because you're going to use your hands anyway. So we got some ground beef in there. We got onions at the bottom. I'm going to start to incorporate those onions into the ground beef. I don't want I don't want stuff remaining on the bottom of the bowl that isn't getting mixed in. So you got to be careful when you mix to make sure the stuff on the bottom gets to the top when you're mixing. Okay, so what else do we need in this recipe? Well, we need some spices. So we've got, let's see, we got some salt. Let's put some salt in there. Now, a lot of this is just eyeballing it because it depends on how much ground beef you put in there, and who knows exactly what you're going to use. So you really just eyeball the spices. I have some garlic powder. Put some of that in there. Nice coating. You know, you want to taste the garlic, so put quite a bit in there. Here's a little bit of oregano. Oregano is a much stronger herb than these other herbs and spices. So take it a little easier with the oregano, but you can give it a nice little light coating. Then we have parsley. Dried parsley almost has no flavor whatsoever. So you can be generous with the amount of parsley you put in here. You know, these are dried ingredients. So because they're dried, God knows how long they've been sitting in your pantry. They may have very little flavor left. So if it doesn't have as much flavor, you got to use more to get more flavor in there. And here's some fresh ground black pepper I'm going to stick in there. Fresh ground pepper is stronger than store-bought pre-ground pepper, so it has more flavor to it. Okay, so I put all those spices in there, and I'm going to mix that up just with my hands, and basically just squeeze the hamburger meat. Let it squeeze between your fingers. Make sure, of course, that your hands were washed before you do this, or I feel sorry for your guests. But I wash my hands. So I'm just going to squeeze this, incorporate those herbs, spices, salt, and okay, I'm going to do more mixing as I add more things, so you don't have to go completely nuts on the initial mixing. Now what do we want to put in there? Well, we're going to put some eggs in there and some milk. The eggs are to bind it. See, you need something to bind the meatballs together. So let's put some eggs in there. Just drop them right in. Now, depending on how much meat you're using, depends on, it will decide how many eggs you should use. Since I'm using a lot of meat, there's 4.5 pounds in here. I think I should use 3 eggs. If it was only a couple pounds, and maybe 2 eggs. If it was 1 pound, maybe one egg. But you need that egg. It acts as a binder. It's like a glue for your meatball. It'll hold it all together. And since you have big chunks of onion and bread in here, you really do need a binding agent. Otherwise, your meatballs are going to fall apart when you're cooking them. Okay, so it's got a lot of wetness about it, but that's okay because we're going to dry it off real quick when we put the bread cubes in. So let's take the bread and let's put that in there. So you can see how the bread is already soaking up a lot of that liquid, that egg. Some more bread in there. Just keep kneading it, making sure everything is incorporated. You don't want any bread pieces sticking out by themselves. You want to make sure that they're all surrounded by meat. Otherwise, they can fall off when you're cooking these meatballs. Okay, and then a last touch. You want to put a little milk on it. Not a lot of milk, just a light splash of milk, like that. Okay, this meatball mix smells good. It's very sticky. You want it to be sticky because you're forming balls out of it. You want the balls to hold together when they're frying. You don't want them falling apart. So this is It's very sticky. This is a perfect consistency. So then what you do is you just take a clump full in your hand, maybe enough to sort of, you could palm it in your hand, and then you just roll it. Just roll the ball between your two hands like this until it has a nice smooth surface. Okay, and then you have a ball. And then you plop it right in the pan. Now I'm going to wash my hands. I'll be right back. All right, so I got all my mom's meatball raw mix. Now I'm just going to make the balls, and then I'm going to stick them in the frying pan, and you can watch them fry. Well, I put them right next to each other, and I make rows of them. I made probably enough to do this whole setup twice, maybe even 2.5 times. Now you can make these meatballs any size you want. I just like these bigger meatballs. This is bigger than a golf ball, but smaller than a baseball. It's basically how much meat fits in the palm of my hand. It's not a Swedish meatball. I like these bigger meatballs are tasty. In order to fit them in a sandwich, you can always cut them in half when you're serving them. Whoever gets it can cut it in half themselves and use a half instead of a full meatball in a sandwich. Now, these meatballs are delicious. They can be used for all sorts of things. You could use it in spaghetti and meatballs. You can make meatball sandwiches. You can, these meatballs are delicious cold. You put them in the fridge. The next day, you take them out, you slice them like, you just slice them. And then you take 2 pieces of bread, put some ketchup on the bread, put the cold meatball in there. Make yourself a sandwich, cold meatball sandwich with ketchup. Delicious. So I rolled all these meatballs, and while they're cooking, I can roll the other meatballs, set them aside, and then when these are done, I already have the pre-rolled meatballs to throw right in the skillet. Now, after a little while, maybe 5 minutes, you want to start turning these meatballs around, getting them off the brown side and letting another part of it cook. And I use one of these fish um, tools because it has a sharp edge on it, and usually the bottom of the meatball sticks to the pan, so this really gets underneath of it and gets it to unstick fairly easily, instead of like a regular spatula, because a regular spatula doesn't have this sharp edge. A fish frying spatula has that, so I like to use this. So I just turn it. See how that side is nice and brown? That's exactly what you want. That's flavor right there. So I just start doing that to all these meatballs. The development of that brown skin is very important. You get a lot of flavor from that. Okay, I'll leave them for now. Let them cook a little bit longer. All right, well, I'm just about done with this meatball meat. There's some onion bits still left in the bottom. That's no big deal. I'll just throw them out. My last meatball is probably the smallest one I've made because that's all the meat I have left. So let's turn these again. And again, you turn them and then you place them on the bottom side down, which has not yet been cooked. Eventually, what you'll find is that these meatballs will internally cook and they'll start to get much more solid and not mushy. And that's at the point where they're done. So if you see any pink, they're not done. But at some point they will. You'll see that pink disappear, and the meatball will become much more solid, like a rubber ball, as opposed to a smushy sort of object. And when it's at that point, that's when it's done. Let's check these. Okay, see, so this one still has some deep red on that side. So let's put that red part down. This one, there's always usually a little part of the meatball that still has red on it. And that's what you want to. That's the side you want to put down if you can. Granted, these things are unstable, so it's not the easiest thing to do. You want to try to get that red area down on the brittle surface. Don't worry about the different sizes of these meatballs. That's perfect. No meatball should be the same. Now these are very tasty meatballs. They're unlike packaged meatballs, frozen meatballs, meatballs you get at a store, meatballs you get at a restaurant, because usually those are made with breadcrumbs or at best stale bread. They aren't made with fresh white bread and a dash of milk. That's what makes these special, along with the onion chunks and the frying. And it has a wonderful aroma. They smell great and they taste delicious. And they're great the next day. You put them in the fridge, even cold, they're delicious. You'll love these meatballs. Once you start making these kind of meatballs, you'll never make another kind of meatball because these are the best meatballs I've ever tasted. And I've had a lot of meatballs from a lot of different places. Now, there comes a point where you can just sort of roll these suckers around and you don't have to worry about scraping them off the surface because they're not sticking. So now at this point, we're just trying to get we've browned all the sides of the meatball. We're just trying to get the internal temperature of the meatball up to a cooked level. Inside, it's still raw and pink. So we got to get that heat going. Another thing you notice, I don't put a lid on top of this. And the reason for that is I want that browning to occur on the surface of the meatball. I don't want a lot of moisture. And if you put a lid on top, the lid's going to trap that moisture and put it back down on my meatball. And that'll prevent the browning that I want. So I leave it open air like this. Now the smaller meatballs are going to get done before the bigger ones. You can already tell, like this one is done. I can tell because it has a certain firmness and bounciness about it. I mean, you could literally pick it up and bounce it. You see that? You could actually bounce it. That bounce. That tells you this thing is done. The one that isn't done isn't going to bounce. See, that guy doesn't bounce at all. See, he's not done. This guy bounces. See that? He's done. And for serving, I would suggest 3 or 4 meatballs per person per serving. They're bigger meatballs, and they go a long way. In a sandwich, you probably only need, in a full torpedo roll sandwich, you probably only need 3 meatballs, 4 at most. And when you put it in the sandwich, you can cut it in half and sort of spread it out throughout the length of the sandwich as well. And it also makes it easier to eat. So when these meatballs are done, what you do is you get yourself a pan. In this case, I have a pizza pan, and you throw some paper towels on top of it. Then you take the done meatball out of the skillet and you put it on the paper towel. And what the paper towels do is they soak up the oil, the excess oil in the meatball. So you leave it there until it cools down to whatever temperature you want to eat it at. Now, if you're making these in advance, you just let it cool off to room temperature, and then you can store it. You can freeze them, put them in your fridge. Or if you're going to eat them, you can plop them in your tomato sauce in a pot of tomato sauce. And the tomato sauce, if it's hot, will warm the meatball up. And then use the tomato sauce and the meatball to make, for instance, meatball sandwiches. That guy's done. Put him in there. Okay, so you get the idea. So these meatballs smell wonderful, and they taste even better than that. You can't go wrong with this recipe. If I were you, I would switch my meatball recipe immediately and go with this one. You won't regret it. So again, here's the recipe for Mom's Meatballs. And try this recipe out. I hope you learned something, and these are delicious. You'll love it. Take care.